The first snowflakes of December dusted the town like confectioner's sugar, glittering under the soft glow of street lamps outside our home. I sat by the window, holding my steaming mug of tea, watching the stillness of the night. The house felt unusually quiet, heavy with the weight of the argument Daniel and I had the night before he left for his business trip. He hadn't looked back when he walked out the door. I wanted to call after him to say something, anything, but the lump in my throat refused to let me speak. Now, with him gone, I was left to sit in the silence, accompanied only by the low hum of the heating vents and the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. Across the room, the Christmas tree stood half-decorated. The box of ornaments lay open on the floor, the delicate glass balls gleaming under the twinkle lights. I had planned to finish decorating it with Daniel, but now the thought of doing it alone seemed unbearable. "Mom." I turned to see Ethan standing at the bottom of the staircase. He was wrapped in his thick sweater and plaid pajama pants. His dark hair tousled like he'd just woken up from a nap. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, setting my mug on the windowsill. He shook his head, walking over to join me by the window. At 22, Ethan had grown into a young man who bore striking resemblance to his father, though his quiet demeanor and empathetic eyes were all mine. He had recently moved back home after finishing college, looking for work and trying to figure out his next steps. I cherished having him here, though the transition hadn't always been smooth. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently, nodding toward the window, as if he could see the argument playing out in my mind. "No," I said too quickly, then softened. "It's nothing. We'll sort it out when he gets back." Ethan didn't push, but his presence felt grounding. He moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of tea before returning to sit across from me. For a while we just sat there, sipping in silence, the only sound the faint wind brushing against the windows. "Do you want help with the tree?" he asked, his voice breaking through the quiet. I glanced at it, hesitating. Decorating the tree had always been a family tradition, but this year felt different, fractured. Ethan must have sensed my reluctance because he added, "It'll keep us busy. Besides, we could both use a little Christmas spirit, don't you think?" His words stirred something in me, and I nodded. "All right. Let's do it." We spent the next hour unpacking ornaments, reminiscing about old memories tied to each one. There was the porcelain angel Daniel had bought on our honeymoon, the glitter-covered pine cone Ethan had made in kindergarten, and the glass heart etched with the date of our wedding. Each ornament told a story, one that felt simultaneously warm and achingly bittersweet tonight. Ethan reached for the star to place at the top of the tree. He was tall enough now that he didn't need a step stool. As he secured it, the lights caught his profile, and for a moment, I saw the little boy who used to race to do this very job every Christmas. "Perfect," I said, smiling as he stepped back to admire the tree. He glanced at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "It's nice doing this with you, Mom." "Me too," I replied, though my voice wavered slightly. The truth was, I hadn't felt this connected to anyone in a long time. As the evening wore on, we settled on the couch with hot chocolate, the glow of the tree bathing the room in soft, golden light. We talked about his plans for the future, about his job applications and the uncertainty he was facing. I listened intently, offering encouragement where I could. It felt good to have these moments, to be the one he confided in. When the conversation lulled, Ethan turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he said softly, "you don't have to carry everything on your own." I looked at him, startled by his insight. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're always trying to keep everything together, for Dad, for me. But it's okay to let someone else carry some of it for a while." His words hit deeper than I cared to admit. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I blinked them away, not wanting to show how much his kindness had affected me. "Thank you, Ethan," I whispered. "That means a lot." He reached out, squeezing my hand briefly before letting go. "You're stronger than you think, Mom. But even strong people need support sometimes." That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat by the tree, the house quiet once again. His words replayed in my mind, offering a strange sense of comfort and clarity. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to stop holding everything so tightly, to allow myself to lean on someone else for a change. As the snow continued to fall outside, I found myself feeling a little less alone. The days passed quietly, blanketed in snow, but the absence of Daniel's nightly calls felt louder with each passing evening. I had told myself I didn't care, that his silence was petty and immature. But in truth, the weight of our argument sat heavy in my chest, its shadow following me even in moments of warmth. Ethan, however, had been my anchor through it all. Ever since we decorated the tree together, our relationship had grown closer. He seemed to sense when I needed company, appearing with a cup of tea or coaxing me into a conversation when I was lost in thought. It felt like old times before college, before the world had changed us both. But beneath our newfound closeness, there was a quiet fear that gnawed at me. The reason for the fight with Daniel lingered like a secret too ugly to name. He hadn't just left on bad terms. He'd left with judgment and disgust simmering in his eyes. "I can't believe you never told me," he'd hissed, throwing my past at me like a weapon. "It was years ago, Daniel," I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady. I was young, desperate. I had no family, no support, and no other options. Amsterdam gave me a way out. Out. He had laughed bitterly. "You're telling me working in the red light district was your salvation?" The shame of those words lingered, and even now they made my stomach twist. I didn't regret what I'd done to survive. How could I? But I did regret Daniel finding out, especially in the way he had. It wasn't supposed to matter anymore. I wasn't that person now. I was a wife, a mother. And yet, as much as I hated the thought of Daniel judging me, I was terrified of Ethan finding out. He would never look at me the same. The third evening after Daniel left, Ethan found me in the kitchen, staring at a half-prepared meal. I'd been chopping vegetables but hadn't made it far, my hands frozen mid-task as my thoughts spiraled. "You okay?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. I forced a smile. "Just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." He nodded, crossing the room to stand beside me. "Let me help." Before I could protest, he was slicing carrots with the same precision and care he brought to everything. I watched him for a moment, the quiet competence of his movements calming me. "Thanks," I murmured, stepping aside to give him space. "Anytime," he said, glancing at me with that familiar softness in his eyes. "You've done enough for everyone else. Let someone take care of you for a change." His words echoed the conversation we'd had by the tree, and I felt my chest tighten. Ethan had a way of cutting through my walls without even trying, and I didn't know how to handle it. I busied myself setting the table, trying to keep my emotions in check. As we ate, Ethan steered the conversation toward light topics, funny memories from his childhood, a story about an eccentric professor he'd had in college. I laughed despite myself, grateful for the reprieve. But as the meal wound down, his tone shifted. "Mom," he said hesitantly, his fork hovering over his plate. "Is everything okay with Dad?" I looked up sharply, caught off guard by the question. "Why would you ask that?" He shrugged, though his expression was serious. "He hasn't called and you seem different. Like something's bothering you." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. How could I explain what was happening without revealing too much? I didn't want to lie to Ethan, but I couldn't tell him the truth either. "It's just marriage stuff," I said finally, forcing a weak smile. "Nothing you need to worry about." Ethan didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." His words were sincere, and for a moment I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself and let him shoulder some of the weight. But the thought of him knowing about my past was too much. I couldn't bear the idea of him looking at me the way Daniel had. His love for me tainted by disappointment or disgust. That night, as I sat in the glow of the Christmas tree, Ethan joined me on the couch, carrying a blanket that he draped over both of us. It was a small gesture, but it felt intimate, almost comforting. I leaned into him slightly, letting his presence ground me. "You're quiet tonight," he said softly, his voice low and soothing. "Just thinking," I replied, my gaze fixed on the twinkling lights. "About Christmas, about the past. About life." Ethan didn't respond right away, but I felt his arm shift, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me. I turned to look at him, and the intensity in his eyes caught me off guard. "You're not alone, you know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's going on, whatever you're carrying, I'm here." The sincerity in his words broke something inside me. I felt tears welling up, and before I could stop myself, they spilled over. Ethan didn't hesitate. He wrapped an arm around me, pulling me close as I cried into his shoulder. "I'm sorry," I whispered between sobs. "I'm so sorry." "For what?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "For not being the mother you deserve," I said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "For not being enough." Ethan pulled back slightly, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "Mom, don't say that. You've always been enough. More than enough. Whatever's going on with you and Dad, it doesn't change that." I searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, but all I saw was unwavering love. It overwhelmed me, and in that moment, I felt closer to him than I ever had before. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't know how much that means to me." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "I love you, Mom. Nothing will ever change that." As I leaned into his embrace once more, I couldn't help but wonder if I was wrong to keep my past a secret. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan's love was strong enough to withstand the truth. But for now, I wasn't ready to take that risk. The snowstorm outside had softened into a steady fall of delicate flakes, settling over the neighborhood like a quilt. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. The faint aroma of roasted garlic and thyme mingled with the scent of the pine tree in the corner, its twinkling lights casting soft shadows across the walls. A bottle of red wine sat on the counter, breathing, while I carefully arranged the finishing touches on the table. Candles, cloth napkins, the good silverware I usually saved for company. Tonight felt like it needed something special. Ethan had spent the day shoveling snow and running errands for me, and I wanted to show my appreciation. But more than that, I had made a decision. The secret I had carried for so long, the one that had driven Daniel away, I couldn't hold it alone anymore. Ethan had been my rock. His steady presence a source of strength I hadn't realized I needed. If I could trust anyone with the truth, it was him. The sound of the front door opening pulled me from my thoughts. Ethan stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots and brushing frost from his hair. He looked up, his face brightening when he saw me. "Wow," he said, glancing at the table. "What's the occasion?" I smiled, though my heart was pounding. "Just wanted to do something nice for you. You've been so helpful lately, and I thought you deserved a treat." He hung his coat and scarf by the door, then crossed the room, wrapping me in a hug. "You didn't have to do all this, Mom," he said softly, his breath warm against my hair. "But thank you." I lingered in his embrace for a moment longer than I should have, savoring the solid feel of him. "Go wash up," I said, pulling away and giving him a playful shove. "Dinner's ready." We sat across from each other at the table, the flickering candlelight casting a warm glow over Ethan's features. He looked so much like Daniel in certain moments, but there was a gentleness to him that his father had always lacked. As we ate, I couldn't help but watch him, my nerves building with each passing minute. "This is amazing," he said between bites, breaking the silence. "You've outdone yourself." "I'm glad you like it," I replied, taking a sip of wine to steady myself. We fell into easy conversation, talking about his plans for the future and the books he'd been reading. But as the meal wound down and our glasses of wine emptied, I felt the weight of my decision pressing against me. "Ethan," I began, my voice hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you." He set his fork down, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, my hands twisting the napkin in my lap. "It's about me. About my past." He tilted his head, his expression softening. You can tell me anything, Mom. You know that. I know, I said, my voice trembling. That's why I need to say this now. Before it eats me alive. Ethan reached across the table, taking my hand in his. Whatever it is, I'll understand. I looked into his eyes, drawing strength from his steady gaze. Before I met your father, I lived in Amsterdam for a while. I was in a difficult place in my life. I had no family, no support, and I made some choices that I thought were my only way out. He didn't interrupt, but his grip on my hand tightened slightly, a silent reassurance. I worked in the red light district, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt heavy as they left my mouth, as though I were laying down a burden I had carried for far too long. It wasn't something I ever planned or something I'm proud of, but it kept me alive when I had nothing else. The silence that followed felt endless. Ethan's expression was unreadable, and I braced myself for his judgment, for the look I had seen in Daniel's eyes. But instead he surprised me. Mom, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you. But you don't have to feel ashamed. You did what you had to do. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I let out a shaky laugh. You don't think less of me. He shook his head, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. Oh, if anything, I respect you even more. It takes strength to survive something like that, and even more strength to share it with me. Relief washed over me, mingled with a deep gratitude for his understanding. Thank you, Ethan, I whispered. You don't know how much that means to me. His gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or fascination. Can I ask you something? Of course. What was it like, he asked, leaning forward slightly. Not just the work, but the life, the city, the people. His question caught me off guard, but I could see the genuine interest in his expression. I hesitated, unsure of how much to share, but his encouragement emboldened me. It was complicated, I said slowly. The city was beautiful, vibrant and alive in a way I'd never experienced before. But the work was demanding, lonely even. I met people from all walks of life, some kind and others less so. It wasn't a life I wanted, but it taught me a lot about myself. Ethan listened intently, his focus never wavering. You're incredible, Mom, he said after a moment. To have gone through all of that and still come out the person you are, it's inspiring. I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, both from his words and the intensity of his gaze. You're too kind, I murmured, my cheeks flushing. It's not kindness, he said, his voice dropping slightly. It's the truth. The room seemed to shrink, the air between us charged with an unspoken tension. For a moment, neither of us moved, the candlelight dancing in his eyes as he held my gaze. Ethan, I began, but my voice faltered. You're incredible, he repeated. His tone filled with admiration and something deeper, something I couldn't name. And I'm glad you trusted me with this. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The connection between us felt stronger than ever, and though I didn't fully understand the emotions swirling in the room, I knew that nothing between us would ever be the same. You've carried so much on your own for so long. You deserve to feel cared for too. I laughed softly, though my voice wavered. You're already doing that, Ethan. More than you know. But he shook his head, standing up and moving around the table to my side. No, I mean it. Let me take care of you tonight. Before I could respond, he placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch warm and steady. You've been through so much. Let me help you relax. Ethan, I began, but he was already guiding me toward the living room. What are you doing? Sit down, he said gently, gesturing to the couch. I'm going to give you a massage. I blinked at him, startled by the offer. That's not necessary. Maybe not, he said with a small smile, but I want to. You deserve to feel good, Mom. His sincerity was disarming, and before I knew it, I had lowered myself onto the couch, the soft cushions enveloping me. Ethan knelt behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. "Just tell me if I'm doing this wrong," he said, his tone teasing but kind. I laughed nervously, unsure what to expect. But as his hands began to knead the tension from my shoulders, I felt myself begin to relax. His touch was firm but careful, each movement deliberate and soothing. "You're really good at this," I murmured, my eyes slipping shut. "I've picked up a few skills," he replied, his voice low and comforting. "You're so tense, though. You need to take better care of yourself." I sighed, the tension melting away under his touch. "I'm trying. It's just, life doesn't always make it easy. That's why I'm here," he said softly. "To help make it easier." There was a warmth in his voice that made my heart ache, and I turned my head slightly, glancing back at him. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means to me." He smiled, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to my cheek. The gesture was sweet, almost innocent, but it sent a wave of emotion through me that I couldn't quite name. "You're amazing, Mom," he said quietly. "I hope you know that." I didn't trust myself to respond, my throat tightening with emotion. Instead, I closed my eyes again, letting the moment wash over me. The sensation of his hands on my shoulders, the soft warmth of the room, the quiet intimacy between us, it all felt like a balm to the ache I had carried for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to simply be cared for, to let someone else shoulder the weight of the world, if only for a little while. And in that moment I realized how much I had needed this, not just the physical comfort but the closeness, the connection. Ethan's hands slowed, then stilled, and I opened my eyes to find him watching me. His expression was tender, his gaze searching. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I'm more than okay," I said honestly. "Thank you, Ethan." He smiled in return, and for a moment we just looked at each other, the unspoken understanding between us stronger than ever. Though the future remained uncertain, in that moment, I felt safe, cherished, and undeniably close to the son who had become my greatest source of strength.